Just a couple of weeks ago, I finished watching a Netflix series called Anne with an E. I don't know if any of you have seen it. It's based on the old 1908 novel Anne of Green Gables. Set in the 19th century, the novel sort of recounts the adventures of Anne Shirley. I think we're familiar with this story, right? She was an 11-year-old orphan who was mistakenly sent to middle-aged siblings, Martha and Marilla, who ran a farm. They had intended to have a boy come help them work on the farm. The story's set in rural Prince Edward Island in Canada. It's basically a coming-of-age tale as Anne navigates life in school and finds her place in this peculiar, created family. A couple of years after setting into this loving home with the Cuthberts, Anne wants to learn more about her biological mother and father. She knew only that her parents had died when she was very, very young. And her desire to learn more wasn't to leave the Cuthberts or to find a better arrangement. She mostly just wanted to know. It's part of her very endearing character. She's an incurably curious and imaginative girl. As Anne gets more and more curious and talks more and more about wanting to know, Marilla becomes defensive and insecure. She wonders what this is all about. In those days, in 19th century, of course, there was no 23andMe or Google search to conduct her search. Finding any information would take some very serious and potentially dangerous travel. So Marilla used the danger of that travel as a very thinly veiled excuse to forbid Anne from pushing on with her search. And pretty quickly, a rift developed between the two as each dug in their heels in the name of love and family. Eventually, though, Marilla came to realize that forbidding Anne to search was having the opposite effect of what she intended. Instead of preserving their bond, her defensiveness, fear, and rigidness were actually driving Anne away. Instead of preserving the relationship, she was destroying it. Contrary to what many believe, family is a strangely fluid thing. The LGBT community knows this very, very well. For a long time, that community has redefined family out of necessity, not just by creating same-sex relationships and raising children, but in the early days, it was more about having to build a chosen family after being kicked out of a family of origin. For a whole bunch of people, family was defined as the people who know and love you, not necessarily the people you come from. That's one of the reasons I love the word family. It's so versatile and expansive. It's kind of like the word neighbor. It invites an inclusion of wider and wider circles in a way that doesn't threaten the initial relationship. Having connection to birth family doesn't diminish relationship with adoptive family. Having step-parents or children doesn't threaten other parenting relationships. Having a network of queer chosen family doesn't diminish or hurt your family of origin. In fact, it can strengthen it. It reminds me of our reading from earlier, the A. Powell Davies reading, right? For what is given still remains to bless the giver when the gift is love. Too often we think of relationships in terms of limited resources. If I give away too much, there won't be enough left. This week, I want to invite us to think beyond that kind of either-or framework. Either I'm with this group or I'm with that group. Either I'm an individual or I'm connected in community. Hopefully, we can lean into a possibility of being both of those things. As you all know, Unitarian Universalism isn't a simple faith to explain. A lot of times I see people try to turn to the 7 principles in an attempt to describe ourselves. The problem is no one memorizes those 7 principles. Some of us have a general idea of the points of most of them. Most of us, though, only remember the first and the seventh. We covenant to affirm and promote, number 1, the inherent worth and dignity of every person, and number 7, the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. I love our principles. They're poetic and do a beautiful job of describing our ideals. My only complaint with them is that number 1 and number 7 should be right up next to each other. Between number 1 and number 7, we talk about democracy and commitment to spiritual growth and world community and justice and acceptance and search for truth and meaning. When we separate them out, when we stick 5 other really important complex ideas in between 1 and 7, it's easy to forget that those two have to work together. The inherent worth and dignity of every person and the web of interdependence. In the past, I've viewed those mostly as competing claims, individualism versus cooperation. This week, though, I'm leaning into the idea that these two might be better seen in concert with each other. When we speak our mind or stand our ground, when we stand up for who we are as a person, we remember that the unique, wonderful individual is a compilation of innumerable influences. And when we celebrate the web of interdependence, at its best, we celebrate the diversity of each person, each species, each being doing its part. The web isn't intended to be one big beige smear of assimilation. Just the opposite. The interdependent web is composed of reciprocal relationships among a diversity of being. As I explored more about this pull between individualism and connectedness this week, I was drawn toward wider conversations around white supremacy culture. You have undoubtedly heard this phrase in the past 6 months. You will hear it more in wider UU circles. The phrase is bracing. I know it's a bracing phrase. Being here in this community, though, where we feel pretty safe, is an opportunity to begin to explore what it means. First, I think it's important to remember we're talking about a culture when we talk about white supremacy culture. A culture is a way that a group of people behave, or the beliefs they have, the values they share, their symbols. Those things get passed down from one generation to the next. It can be difficult to identify the characteristics of our own culture because it's as close as the air that we breathe. We take it for granted. I think we all know what culture means, right? But I think it's really helpful to keep focus on culture when we hear those words, white supremacy culture, together. So, what is it? White supremacy culture is an ideology that white people and the ideas, thoughts, beliefs, and actions of white people are superior to people of color and their ideas, thoughts, actions, or beliefs. And it's a whole lot more than that. White supremacy culture is also a whole set of ideas that you and I and most of the people we know embrace on a daily basis. It's a whole scaffolding of beliefs that enable racism without even knowing it. There are things like individualism, competition, a sense of urgency or timeliness, objectivity. These aren't explicitly racist ideas. Under the right circumstances, they can even be useful, but taken together, these values prop up a whole system that suggests white people are inherently more valuable. I've been struggling to wrap my head around white supremacy culture and its characteristics. This week, it dawned on me that several of those characteristics sabotage our first and seventh principles. White supremacy culture distorts belief in the inherent worth and dignity of every person into a sense of isolation and competition. White supremacy culture deforms the interdependent web into assimilation and conformity. Let me get a little bit more specific about how this works. Individualism is something that we're all familiar with. In fact, we kind of celebrate it. But it's a bit of a double-edged sword. Individualism also encourages people to feel like they're uniquely responsible for achieving goals or solving problems. It also points toward individual recognition and credit for achievement rather than a whole community. It's related closely to competition. I need to prove myself as an individual so that I can achieve in this competitive world. Related to that individualism is perfectionism. And this is something that I know a lot of us deal with. Perfectionism is that trap that makes us feel like our mistakes are personal failures. I want to repeat that. Perfectionism is when mistakes feel like personal failures. It's a tendency to mistakenly base our value on our performance. And finally, either-or thinking that I was talking about before. Either thinking the results are good or the results are bad. Something is right or wrong. Others are with us or they're against us. All of these distinct characteristics of white supremacy culture can distort our first principle. Respect for the inherent worth and dignity of every person. If we're not careful, it can be misunderstood, weaponized. In a similar way, our seventh principle can also be the target of some of the characteristics of white supremacy culture. In that culture, a sense of urgency undermines inclusiveness and problem solving. And defensiveness upholds existing power structures. In white supremacy culture, a fear of open conflict, the emphasis on being polite and orderly turns the blame onto anyone who raises a problem or a concern. White supremacy culture assumes that the people in powerful positions have the right to comfort. In a nutshell, it's invested in maintaining the status quo, maintaining the existing structure, maintaining a mirage of unity by silencing dissent. It pushes toward a web of control, a web of assimilation, a web of coerced unity. It's a major threat to that interdependent, life-affirming, diverse web that we celebrate. So I've come across several different documents that identify the traits of white supremacy culture. What I was able to include here is a very, very small and simplified description. I want to encourage you, though, to Google search the characteristics of white supremacy culture when you have a chance. It's not for fun or for comfort. It's for learning. If the phrase makes you uncomfortable, as it probably does, that's great. But don't stick your head in the sand. Make an effort to understand what you're disagreeing with. The list of characteristics of white supremacy is particularly challenging reading for most of us. It challenges us because so many of those characteristics are beliefs and values that we've all been taught to uphold. In fact, our success in our careers and our personal lives has often depended on adhering to those values. Before we move on, I want to address why do we use that phrase, that harsh, grating phrase of white supremacy culture. For educators who use it, and more for myself as I'm understanding it, they say it's important to name that we live in a culture that reproduces, sometimes overtly, but mostly very subtly, the idea that white is superior. Those of us who live in this culture, including those who push against racism, still swim in it, a lot of times oblivious to it. So while we are not white supremacists, we do live in white supremacy culture. There are lots of ways to push back against it. One of those ways is by living into the fullness of our first and seventh principles. I'm not talking about memorizing them, although that is a lovely thing to do, or saying, yes, I agree. I mean opening our hearts to see and to feel those truths on a daily basis. We affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person and the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. One principle without the other is just not enough. In fact, one without the other is a dangerous imbalance. Living our inherent worth and dignity is permanently bound together with being a part of something bigger than ourselves, giving ourselves up to a bigger love. Amen.